What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. And you are in for a treat today. It seems like I say that often, but today you will be impressed. This story is disturbing. The remains of 10 men and 6 women have been pulled from the Chicago River and Lake Michigan since the beginning of last year, going back to 2022, prompting fears of a serial killer possibly terrorizing the community. We are expecting Ken Larson, formerly of the FBI. He's the one having some tech issues, so we're standing by for him. But we've got Sarah Kalin, as in Kato Kalin, she told me.
No relation.
She is a former police officer and sex crimes detective with a decade of service in federal and municipal law enforcement agencies. She also served as co-creator, executive producer, and host of the four-part docuseries Hell in the Heartland, What Happened to Ashley and Loria on HLN and HBO Max. She's been a featured consultant and commentator on numerous true crime podcasts, including Wondery's Manslaughter and Rabia Chowdhury's Undisclosed. Sarah is also a team investigator for the Cold Case Foundation, and she comes recommended from none other than Dr. Gary Bricado, who has gone MIA on us, but he will be back when his schedule permits. The man in the red shirt, who looks like a Chicago police officer recently retired, is Willis Villar. He spent 31 years and 7 months, but who's counting, as a Chicago police officer at the Chicago PD, the famed Chicago PD with the funny police hats. 27 years, roughly, in homicide. He retired as an officer-involved shootings investigator supervisor. You can't have two better guests to discuss this. And as I mentioned, it is a disturbing story. Starting with you, Will. You were telling me right before we went on camera, you fielded so many questions about this. How far back do those questions go, and what was the sort of the predominant question among them?
So the question I always get is there a serial killer who's pushing people into the Chicago River and Lake Michigan? And that's gone back to, probably when the media got a hold of this and it got onto the internet, I don't know if you've heard the term smiley face killer. Have you heard that one?
I have. And we'll get into that, what that's all about, because some people think it may be connected.
Yes. So that's basically when it all started, and everybody from the neighborhood, because of my background, wants to know if I think there's a serial killer. And most people think that there is, actually.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you said "are," because the smiley face killer, some people imply that it could be multiple killers. Sarah, to you, how did you first get involved? And I know you were an officer in another jurisdiction completely where there was a similar case. So how did you become involved in all this?
Yeah, I first sort of became aware of this as an issue actually back in 2006. I spent the bulk of my patrol time with a suburban agency in the Columbus, Ohio area, and in 2006 we had Brian Schaefer went missing, who kind of like lines up in this same pattern of the mid-20s, conventionally attractive man disappears from a bar in a sort of a party area. And he has never been found. No remains have ever been found, but the Olentangy River runs right through the middle of Ohio State campus. It runs really close to the bar. And so there's always been a lot of speculation that at some point, somehow, something happened and he ended up there. But as I left, kind of regular patrol and detective work and began, diving more academically into serial predation and criminal behavior, I just sort of started ticking off little boxes whenever I would see cases that actually reminded me of Brian Schaefer. And it's just been over the last 15 years or so that I've sort of amassed a little collection of them. Even before I knew that I had heard of the smiley face killer. I I know we'll get into it a little bit later. I tend to think, at least at this point, the theory has completely jumped the shark. But I was sort of following this on my own, just kind of through the years. And last week, I actually presented a series of these cases, including several of the Chicago ones we're going to talk about tonight, as well as some others from around the country over the last 15 or 20 years, including Brian Schaefer as well, to a group of cold case consultant, another cold case consultancy group that I work with out of Boston College and Johns Hopkins. And so Dr. Mercado is in there. And when I guess you reached out to him about this one, he said, "Oh, hey, this lady's a little obsessed with this notion. You should talk to her."
And so, Sarah, you're kind of a story unto itself, because you were a police officer. What got you so involved, I guess, in the psychology, the predation, as you're saying, and you're one of the one of the super sleuths now. Is that right?
I actually am a founding member. I founded the group with Dr. Burgess and Dr. Patch and Dr. Berta. So the four of us actually met up in late 2020 and decided to put this group together. And then we began in January 2021 with the first meeting. So I've been fortunate enough and honored enough to work with Dr. Burgess as sort of the head of our team, and shepherding this group through some of these cases that people from around the world have been bringing us. But the psychology thing was actually the reason I got into law enforcement in the beginning. It was always about this. I grew up in Gainesville, Florida, which a lot of people know is sort of a hotbed of serial killers. And just from a young age, when, Bundy was housed 20 minutes away and we were all kind of terrified of him. And I was 15 the summer that Danny Rolling, murdered the 5 students at the University of Florida. I lived through that, and so it became a focus for me at a fairly young age. And so my path into law enforcement was always, the plan was to make my way into investigations and then eventually make my way into studying serial predation.
Well, you're talking to the son of a psychiatrist and the son of a social worker. So I'm into the psychology of all this.
Me too.
Find it really fascinating. By the way, the legend, Dr. Ann Burgess, is coming on the show Thursday night to discuss BTK. We just had Carrie Rawson, who is Dennis Rader's daughter, on the show. She had a lot to say, and those cold cases are heating up. So Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll be on the show. Kansas Girl says, "I've been following these deaths for many months. Happy Joel and his best guests are discussing this." So Will, now that you're happily retired, what's the word on the street amongst the Chicago police officers? Is it sort of much ado about nothing, or is there some sort of trepidation? And then we'll get into some of the details of the case, but is there kind of an underlying fear that maybe there's someone out there causing some of these deaths?
Within the police department and the people that are doing the investigations, the answer to that question is there is no serial killer running around Chicago. Mm-hmm. Well, doing these crimes anyway. There might be one, but we don't think it's a guy throwing people in the river.
And some of these deaths, as we're about to find out, a few of them, are ruled suicide. Some, there's no manner of death or cause of death. But to you, Sarah, this guy Noah Enos, he's the most recent victim. He was pulled from the water. His body was recovered June 17th, 5 days after he went missing from a rock concert at a place called the Salt Shed, which is really just a small venue. And again, in this particular case, officials have yet to release the cause and manner of his death, but the family is working with private investigators to, quote unquote, try to find justice for Noah. Does this particular case strike you as odd in any way? What have you learned about it?
Well, I'm looking back over my notes because Noah's case is one of the ones that I discussed last week in the presentation that I did. And if memory serves, his was the one, his body was recovered almost immediately behind the club where he had been, right? Like it was only, like 50 yards or something down to the water.
Yeah.
Am I misremembering that in that one, they said they found prescription drugs in his system, and they were ruling it an accidental overdose. Or because, like I said, I presented about 20 of these, so I may be mixing them up. That was my memory of the one with Noah Enos.
I don't have that in my notes, but
okay.
that doesn't
I don't want to.
Doesn't mean it's not the case. So
I don't. Well, and I don't want to.
And Will, I don't know if you know Will, but do you happen to know Will?
For that particular case, I don't know what the pathology, if they even have it back yet. It actually takes quite a long time for the MEs to come back with the post, the notes from the post and the pathology. It takes a while. Yeah, I don't know specifically about that one.
Yeah, so I may be linking him up with somebody else, but like I said, he is one of the ones that is on my list. He falls, a lot of these guys that I've been looking at from the cases around the country. The pattern is so similar in that, like I said, they go missing from a bar. It tends to be within a party district, often near a university or someplace frequented, where it's like bar, all right in a row. Not only does he fall obviously within that, but there are a number of these subjects through, these numerous cases that actually resemble each other physically, not just that they sort of, line up in terms of a description, mid-20s, good looking, athletic build, whatever, but that they actually physically resemble each other. And Noah is one who, out of a handful of about 5 guys who all kind of look really, really similar, which is another reason it jumped out at me. I think we tend to lend too much credence to the idea that serial killers have like a distinct look that they always go for. But it is also something that can't be completely ruled out, right? When we're looking at a pattern of, is this just a pattern of really unfortunate circumstances, or is there a reason to think that there might be one person responsible? So that's one of the reasons that Noah did stand out to me, is that he just physically looks like a number of the other subjects.
Yeah, it is important to point out that some of them, the bodies that have been recovered, are women too. But to Sarah's point, Will, how important is it for you as a former homicide investigator, to look at victimology? I don't know, how closely you've studied this particular case, but I know you spent 3 decades plus at the Chicago PD. The point Sarah is making, that some of these victims literally look similar and the patterns are very similar. Does that give you reason to pause at all?
Well, I don't discount anything, but to Sarah's point, these guys and girls are coming up missing from party areas. And if you're familiar with the city, the Chicago River kind of loops around the city, and then Lake Michigan obviously is its own thing. Now, Lake Michigan, for people that don't know, it's a big lake. It's more of an inland ocean than it is a lake, where there's locks and dams and there's currents. And we've had people that go in the water, like at 55th Street, and end up in Michigan. So I can't discount the fact that these kids look alike, but it's also, we're looking at a demographic where the only thing we can see that pushes them together is consumption of alcohol and their age group and the proximity of water.
Mm-hmm. I love investigators because I've learned from the best. You can't discount anything, and that's exactly what Will said. What I can count on is Tali from Israel. She's always in the house. She's here right now saying hello. She was here earlier. Ketchup, big friend of the show. Frankie Figs, Kitty's here. Lorna McKenzie. Mark became a YouTube member. So shout out to all the members of STS Nation. I'm not going to lie. I'm a little bit brain dead after a show earlier today, and even the prospect of another Alec Murdaugh trial scares me. Someone up here, and I just lost the comment, said Chicago has multiple serial killers. Just as a broader point, Sarah, and Will, feel free to weigh in afterwards, but how many serial killers, this is your world, I mean, how many serial killers are out on the loose in America right now? We had this debate on a previous show, and it was much higher, I think, back in like the 80s. But do you have a number on how many serial killers are out and about?
I don't have a number. I don't have a fixed number because it depends on the researcher that you who you listen to the most recently, who will tell you anywhere between, you know, a couple hundred or 3,000 or whatever. The one answer that I will give universally that I feel really comfortable with is when somebody asks me how many serial killers are there out there, I say more than you think there are. And that I think remains true. I think the reason that we see, I often refer to the 70s, 80s, and 90s as sort of the serial killer bubble. You know, like we had a tech bubble and a housing bubble, and there was this sort of serial killer bubble. And there were a whole confluence of events through the 40s and 50s that kind of led to this. But the main reason we see fewer of them racking up the numbers that we used to see in the 70s and 80s and stuff is quite simply we are better at catching them faster. So they're just not able to, you know, we can look at somebody like a Brian Kohnberger, right, who most certainly would have gone on to commit multiple, you know, serial sexual homicides. And instead, he's captured what is most likely the first time he sets out to it, because just, you know, the tools both in forensics and in criminal psychology and investigations are just worlds better than they were 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah, and it's getting tougher and tougher for criminals. Yep. Happy to invite Ken Larson into the conversation. He's wearing a Hawaiian shirt like the great Phil Waters, our Houston homicide detective, wears every Friday from the Big Island. Ken Larson, for those who do not know, he's been on the show before. He's a retired detective out of Fairfax County PD, and he's a retired FBI program analyst. So he is here. Ken, good to see your face. Just broadly speaking, you know, we invited you on. Just macro-wise, from the research you've done, do you lean toward a serial killer or away from a potential serial killer in the city of Chicago?
That's a great question. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we do. Yep.
Okay, so I tell you, and then I'm not a big person in speculation. But there definitely are patterns, and you can see again. I think I missed the beginning of the episode, but the victims and the type of victims and the education levels and the ages and the looks and so forth, and it's very, very, very convenient to be found in water. Of course, one of the best ways to ruin evidence, but. You know, I don't know if you guys talked about the NYPD detectives and the happy smiley face murders and stuff like that. Did you get into that at all?
We've briefly mentioned it. We're going to get into that in a little more depth. Yeah, but Sarah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
No, I was just going to say that they've devoted a large portion of their lives into this, and they certainly believe it. And if you listen to them and listen to the expert there, you know, they believe that there's certainly a pattern. So, yeah.
Yeah. Sarah, Heather N says, does anything link these murders together other than the area? You just pointed out some of the things in terms of looks. And Will mentioned party areas, you know, bars. What else stands out to you, Sarah, when you're looking at this?
So one of the cases that I became aware of after I had started, you know, looking at stuff back when Brian Schaefer disappeared many years later in 2013, I became aware of a 2000 case that happened kind of north of Philadelphia here in a town called New Hope. And it was, you know, this case, that particular case kind of looked like a lot of all of these, right? He was at a bar in like a nice, you know, a row of bars. He walks across the bridge. It's like where the Pennsylvania, New Jersey line is. So you can actually walk across the bridge into New Jersey. And he walked across the bridge and disappeared and was later found in a canal that ran along the Delaware River. And the reason I heard about that 2000 case in 2013 was that a woman had gone missing from the same bar, walked across the same bridge, and had turned up in the same canal some days later. And there was, I'm not going to like name some, you know, individual right now just out of suspicion, but there was a person linking both of them. who was eliminated as a possible suspect in both cases, in spite of the fact that this person had no credible alibi for either of the times that these people went missing and were found drowned in the river. And so I sort of have, a part of my little rabbit hole has been to see if I can find a way where that link between those two people could possibly be linked to any of these other ones that I've examined over the years across the country. That's the most I want to say. I don't want to throw, some person completely to the wolves, but that's part of what I keep looking at.
Will, back to you, former Chicago PD, Frankie Figgs, friend of the show. The common denominator has been young males, alcohol, and lots of water access. There have been women, but if you're back in Homicide, and I know it's probably not your first and foremost choice since you just retired in July, but let's say you're back there, are these patterns enough for you to at least take a second, possibly a third look at these victims? Obviously, their families are going to want you to, but is it enough to get you kind of motivated to reinvestigate things you've already investigated?
Well, I can tell you, like you said, the family. Here's a couple of things. One, and I've done a lot of notifications to families. It's very, very difficult for a family to accept the death of a thriving, healthy young person without some sort of explanation. Walking into the water, suicide, really, really tough for people to wrap their heads around that. But as far as these cases go, every one of these cases that touch Chicago were investigated in the same manner. We go for triangulation of cell phones, whatever the route to the water is, cameras are looked up. And I can tell you, in a lot of our cases, we watch them walk into the water. Some of them are walking to the point where it's really, really dark. They don't even see it. I don't even think they know they're going in the water. But to Ken's point, there's a lot of similarities into the victims. Sarah talked about it too. We have to deal with evidence if we're going to bring forth some sort of a homicide investigation. And and you talked about it earlier, Joel, cause and manner of death. I think the cause of death in almost all these cases, if I'm not mistaken, is drowning. Manner is a little different. A lot of times the medical examiner will say undetermined pending police investigation. Then we have to go in and we have to do that police investigation, present to the medical examiner all of the evidence that we have, the video, the cell phone access, all of that stuff. And then the medical examiner can make a determination as to manner. That doesn't take, it's a long time sometimes.
Ken Larson, do you, for those of us who are not professional investigators, can you kind of delineate between cause and manner of death and why in some cases the cause might be revealed, but not the manner necessarily?
I believe that some of these cases, they were ruled accidental, right? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, because I have people here that know more than me about this, but there were a couple of them, they were unknown, the deaths were unknown because there was no water in their lungs, right? So how do you drown if you don't have water in your lungs, right? It's forensic. I know that they have to deal heavily with the medical examiner and the autopsy reports as to how they died. They're the experts, and that's what you're going to have to go future in the court if you ever need it. But again, correct me if I'm wrong, but not all of them have been classified as drowning, and some of them I think were suicides, right? If I'm correct. And there was another thing that was interesting is that many of the bodies were found face up rather than face down, which is like an indication that possibly they were killed and they were put into the water that way. So speculation.
Ken, that's an interesting point. When I don't know the answer to this, but when you drown, are you always found? Do you always wind up face down when you drown?
Research that a little bit that I've done before you guys invited me here was that yes, most of the time an individual who drowns, the body rolls that way, and of course, drowning is the filling of the cavity in the lungs with water, and that some of the bodies did not have that water in their lungs. So that's interesting to me. How did they die? And were they disposed in the water?
Interesting.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Starry Crystal Night. I lived in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where some of the smiley face killer cases are alleged to have happened. Well, this is funny because I think this is actually genuine from Bronwyn. Hello, A, from Vancouver Island. The A there, I think, is real. Not, I would say it is a joke, but she's saying it for real. Finally catching a live show because I'm on holidays. Enjoy the holiday. Meg P is in the house. Sarah, you know more about this than pretty much anyone, but in terms of drowning, is that a universal truth that you do wind up face down? And in some of these cases, they were found face up, and that would the presumption would be that they were placed in the water that way.
So I'm not a criminalist, I'm a criminologist. So I always want to be real clear that, there's definitely a difference. And when it comes to something, like how people are found in a drowning, I'm not an expert by any means. I am lucky though that my best friend is a coroner. And so I've kind of fielded some of these questions to her. And I know, like, just listening to her talk about cases where she's recovered drowning bodies and stuff. And my understanding is that Ken is correct in that it is pretty typical that the body's going to turn over just based on the physics, I guess, of like the way the air is moving and stuff like that. But I definitely am not an expert in that area.
Merritt Seeger says Florida has some odd folks. I'm one of them. I live here now, but I'm from Jersey, which has equally an odd amount of folks. So just to some of the details of this case or cases. The remains of 10 men, 6 women since the beginning of 22 have basically washed up either on the banks of the Chicago River and or Lake Michigan, which Will astutely pointed out is not just any lake. It's one of the Great Lakes. It's massive. They've been pulled from both the Chicago River and Lake Michigan, prompting these fears. Patterns have been looked at. 5 men's bodies in just the last 6 months. Will, to you, I don't know how closely you keep stats, but I looked at some of the drowning stats, and they actually are down a little bit, according to the statistics that I looked at. And you raised an interesting point, and I don't want to delegitimize or take away the pain or even suggest that it's not a murder. But you raised an interesting point. These are young people in the prime of their lives who just die. So it leads one to believe that something had to have happened to them in order to end up that way, right? Well,
I mean, that's if it happened to one of my family members, God forbid, I would have a problem. Somebody telling me, listen, we don't know what happened. The thing is, and the bodies that are taken out of the water, and I don't know the ones that Ken's talking about, because all the ones that I know about had water in their lungs. And as far as bodies being face up or face down, I've pulled them out of the water face up and face down. But, that also, there's a lot of things involved with maybe catching on a piece of debris that spins them, how long they've been in there. A lot of the bodies we recovered are under the water that we've recovered with the use of a cadaver dog that actually, it's out of DuPage County. There's a cadaver dog that can literally smell the bodies in the water. And the accuracy of this dog is incredible. But again, I don't want to discount any theories that something might be going on. But what I'm telling you in our cases is, and I've pulled a lot of bodies out of the water that were murdered and thrown in the water, to Ken's point. But there's always a cause on it. There's a bullet wound. There's strangulation. There's crushed hyoid bones. There's something. There's a deep stab wound. There's something that indicates the body was murdered and then put in the water. And in some of the cases, like Ken also pointed out, water's a good place to get rid of evidence. But when you have an injury to a bone or a skull fracture or something like that, they do stick around after being in the water.
Sarah, these are photos of some of the more recent victims. You're looking at Christoph Schubert, Joel Orduño, Peter Salvino, Noah Ennis, he's the latest to be pulled out, and Seamus Gray. Are these the ones that you kind of suggesting almost look similar to each other?
It's funny, actually. The first three young men are not ones that like I have sort of examined them. Seamus and Noah both were on my list. There's also I think you referenced, you guys were looking, or at least what people are kind of talking about lately is since the beginning of 22. And they're also one of the ones that alerted to me a few years ago was Iñaki Bascarin, which I may be saying his name incorrectly. But he was in 2021, and that was another one. He may have been just north of the city in one of the suburbs. I know one of the guys that I've looked at was in a suburb just north of Chicago. So that might be why he's not on the list. But yeah, some of these guys, some of them really look similar. The other thing, without pulling too much energy away from Chicago, because I know that's what you're here to talk about, but when you're looking at like a whole bunch of these that happened in a run of time, New York City, there were 3 men who left the same bar, or actually the same nightclub, the Brooklyn Mirage, all 3 of whom were found then in the Newtown Creek sometime later. And so that's one that, that was just in July of this year, or June and July, and kind of in that same run of time. And so I know that New York said, actually maybe one is still missing, but the 2 who ended up in the water were in the same place. And when the first young man went missing, who looks not dissimilar from the middle gentleman on the pictures you just had up, they said it was definitely an accident. And then when another one happened from the same bar within 3 weeks, oh, I'm sorry, the second one, Joel, they now that the NYPD is saying like, okay, we also need to re-examine these. But again, in both of those, it was ruled a drowning. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. And I know if Gary was here, he would want us to point out that statistically we have never been aware of a serial killer who killed purely by drowning. Plenty who practiced with it in their early, before they really ramped up their career in terms of like, attempted drownings or kind of playing with torture drownings with like family members or partners and stuff, but that we have not ever seen that before. And he's right. And that is something we have to really take into consideration is what is what is psychologically the serial killer getting out of it if it's purely a drowning, unless there's some sort of a substance we're not picking up that he's actually, you administering some poison or something that we're not picking up.
And the great Gary Bricado sent me a statement that he gave me permission to use for this show. And Ken and Will, if you're not familiar, Gary Bricado is a PhD, studies serial killers for a living. He's an academic and a scholar. He says, I'm aware of no case in the annals of crime of a serial killer using drowning as the means of murder. Dumping in water after other forms of homicide, yes, absolutely, but not drowning. And also other forms of asphyxiation are common. He went on to say, this is a little long, but I think it's interesting. Ted Bundy experimented with asphyxiation by dunking a girlfriend's head underwater and watching her struggle to breathe. Gacy liked water torture, where he submerged a boy's head in a bathtub of water to tease drowning. But those were just isolated cases within their larger patterns. You may quote me on these facts, and I am right now, Gary. So,
can I just want to devil's advocate real quick here. And that is because for exactly the reason we're having this conversation. And I do tend to line up with Gary. I mean, I think in general, I sort of land with the evidence as well, like what Will was saying. But I do have to say that it is a clever way to kill somebody without inflicting physical injury if they are incapacitated enough to do it. So there may have been other serials we just never caught who were doing this. Just devil's advocate.
I mean, well, I think that's a great point. Go ahead. Will, was that you? Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, to Sarah's point, and also, it's hard to drown someone. It's hard to compel somebody unless they're completely incapacitated.
Yeah.
There has to be a struggle. I'll tell you this, you hit the water in the wintertime when the water temperature is 34 degrees, you're not going to be in that water a lot of time before you go under it. But just the idea of getting someone to go into the water without physically helping them into the water, it's not a surprise that we haven't really seen that type of activity out of serial killers. It's just difficult.
By the way, one of the coldest times I've ever been in my life was trying to scalp tickets to see Michael Jordan in Chicago. My ears almost fell off my head, and that was March. They call it the Windy City for a reason. By the way, shout out to El Rose, who is listening in Australia, where it is now Wednesday morning. Ken Larson, go ahead.
I was just going to comment, and I think I said it earlier. I don't think there's a greater way besides burning to dilute evidence, but throw somebody in the water, especially if they're gone 7, 10, 11 a month. Your evidence is really limited. Again, like Will said, well, you get a bullet wound in the back of the head or fractures or so forth. That's you're not going to get rid of that. But to dilute evidence and put them in water and let them soak for a long time, I mean, that would be my thinking why these, if it's true and the patterns line up, why they're in the water is to dilute the evidence.
And Will, Merritt brings up a good point, drugged with something that impairs them. What about the possibility, for lack of a better phrase, they were roofied, let's say, in a bar? Is that something that would show up, Will, obviously in the toxicology reports?
Most of the time it would, depending on, like Ken talked about, depending on how long the body's been in the water. Now, the issue with that is in a lot of these cases, we've gotten video of them leaving the bar. And yes, there is they are impaired. In almost every one of the cases, they're impaired. But sometimes it's a bit of a distance between where they left and where they go into the water. Now, the salt shed's different. The river runs right behind it. But there's quite a bit of a distance. And in a lot of the cases, we have the people walking towards the water or an area of access to the water, and they're alone. And the ones that they have made rulings on, there's actually physically see them going into the water. But yes, I think I agree with whoever made that comment. They are impaired. That's another one of the commonalities is they are impaired.
And Will, we got the best guests in true crime, but we got a better community, and we got a really smart community in Tracy Lynn. I have not heard this. You're in Chicago. Tracy Lynn says 2 male bodies washed up on 2 Chicago beaches this past Saturday morning. One of the beaches is in my neighborhood. Are you familiar? Have you heard this news, Will? I have not heard this.
I heard about one. I heard about one drowning, but I didn't know about 2. I know somebody did wash up on the beach, and just so you know, there is a sergeant and kind of like a little task force that looks into every single one of these drownings with the idea that possibly they're related. And so far, we can't put anything other than what we talked about earlier. We can't put any links between the victims.
Sarah, back to you brought up New York City. Catherine said there are similar cases happening in New York City now. When did you say those bodies washed up? Was just this past July? And where does that case stand?
Yeah, so July, there were 2 of them, I believe. Let me look at my notes real quick here. The June 11th in Brooklyn was Carl Clementi, and then July 29th was John Castick. And both of those young men left the Brooklyn Mirage nightclub and were later found in the Newtown Creek. And to Will's point, in terms of how far most of them had to go, I will say all the ones that I included sort of in my list when I did this presentation about these sort of nationally last week, every one of them I'm able to, do a map to where they believe where they were found, and specifically where the body was found. And all of them were at or just under a mile to a half a mile. So, if you're drunk, that's a mile is a long, long, long walk. But 4 or 5 blocks isn't necessarily. So yeah, they're all the ones that I have looked at. They've been relatively close to the water, but not nearly as close, most of them, as the salt shed.
And Ken Larson, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm about to, because Cece's asking a question. What percentage of men are victims of a serial killer? Does anyone know? Or, everyone assumes that obviously more women are victims, but anyone know? Ken, any idea? Sarah, any idea?
Sorry.
It's It's certainly lower, but what we do tend to find is that it's obviously it's male on male. So you still tend to find that the overwhelming majority of the perpetrators are male. So I mean, I could try and look it up for you real quick while we're sitting here. But it is, like Ken said, it's definitely it's significantly lower, but it's not as unheard of, I think, as people think when they just picture, because you look at who are a couple of the most famous are, Dahmer and BTK and stuff. These were male on male killings.
So Tracy Walder is a guest we have on our show pretty frequently. She's a former CIA, former FBI. And she was quoted in the New York Post, Ken Larson. This is more in your wheelhouse. She says, there's too many coincidences. And she talks about, thinks that it could be a serial killer at work right now. Pointed out there are cases of accidental drownings, but there are just short periods of time, she says, where multiple victims have been found. Just back to your training, both, at the local level and for the feds, how closely do you look at these patterns? I mean, how key are patterns to solving a case potentially?
They're a great tool as far as utilizing the statistics. I don't know if did anybody mention the fact about the cab drivers, or what they call them, gypsy cab drivers?
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that, but feel free to. The gist of it is that there were basically gypsy cabs offering rides to these young people in Chicago, either for free or like a discounted rate. Is that right, Ken?
Yeah, and I only bring that up because we're pretty familiar with them. Everybody here on the squad here is familiar with how they work. You get somebody who's out of a bar 1, 2, 3 in the morning. They may have limited cash. They want to get home. Uber, they can't get it, so they grab one of these very convenient gypsy cabs, and they're also very common since we're talking Chicago, and also the cases in New York. For me, that's interesting because if somebody would get it, especially if you have cases like Will said, you have the body that's found 7, 8 miles down from where they last were seen. I mean, the person, if they're that inebriated and they can't walk 6 or 7 miles, I mean, let's be honest, most people can't, right? So, I mean, I find that a little interesting, and just looking at putting people on a round table and throwing ideas out there. And one of them would be like, if there is a common denominator, the gypsy cab type of drivers that are out there, I know they're a problem. They're not regulated. Everybody's too busy with their own crime statistics to even look at them. So I do find that interesting, an interesting possibility.
There was actually another case out of the Brooklyn Mirage between Clemente and Castic that involved a man who was abducted by a gypsy cab driver, exactly like this. He couldn't get an Uber, so he got this gypsy cab, and that guy then picked up a friend. They abducted this guy, drove him around, made him take money out of different ATMs and stuff. But in that case, they then drove him to a hospital in Connecticut. Sorry, my dog is getting worked up. They drove him to a hospital in Connecticut and dropped him off alive, and were picked up by the cops within a matter of like minutes. So in that one, we don't think is connected necessarily to at least to Castic, because he happened after those guys were in custody. But it doesn't, to Ken's point, rule out the possibility that that's just a problem going on in these sorts of areas that could be, unrelated homicides, but committed by similar offenders.
By the way, we don't go through a show without at least one dog barking. We're a dog friendly show here. It happened this afternoon multiple times. But Sarah, you're not the intimation is not that the New York and Chicago are related, just that they're two separate cases, right? Or we don't know.
I mean, for the presentation that I put together is that these could all be independent, total random. It could be, a couple of pockets. Like I said, I do not subscribe to the idea of a team of serial killers operating around the world that is asinine. That's just not how serial predation works. But I also couldn't rule out the possibility of at least some of these in different cities being linked to one killer if we're looking at commonalities and victimology.
News crasher for Will. Most of these are on the north side of Chicago or downtown. Will, are they sort of spread around, or are they in one particular area?
They are spread around. A lot of them. Downtown is a big area. You got Wrigleyville. See, Chicago is a lot. It's a bunch of neighborhoods. Wrigleyville is way up north, but Loyola is even farther north. We've had bodies go in the water there. The Chicago River, like I said, kind of loops around the whole area. And what Sarah was saying about the thing in Brooklyn, everybody's kind of going into the water or found in the water in generally the same area. We've got people going in the water everywhere around the river and also the lake. Ken's point is, as far as the gypsy cab goes, it's absolutely a problem in Chicago, but most of it's robberies, like Sarah was talking about. But the problem with the city of Chicago is there's so much water surrounding it. We've got people going in the water in various locations, and also turning up, like one you talked about that touched the city, Sarah. We believe he went in somewhere off Montrose Harbor and ended up washing up in Wilmette, the south suburb. And like I spoke of earlier, we've had him go in the water downtown and end up in Indiana.
I was going to say, Michigan. I saw one that they pulled the subject out of the water in Gary, and I got immediately online and I looked and I was like, oh, I guess it is possible.
And those are the ones like Ken was talking about is you're going to have trouble with any kind of physical evidence.
And Will, to that point, I was just going to ask you, not to get too gruesome, but you were in Homicide for a better portion of your career. What does water do to the human body when it's in there too long?
Well, it's depending on temperature, but it's not just the water. It's not just the putrefaction remains in the water. It's the animals and fish that live in the water. It's the turtles. It's fish, and I mean that is just a big piece of bait basically that ends up in the water, and it just putrefies all the remains. The bloating. It's without to be too graphic. Like Ken said, other than a fire, it's one of the worst things that can happen to a body.
J. Thomas Reese said, friend of the show, my dog is now barking. What's going on? Maybe it's the end of the world, and we don't have to worry about any of this. Who knows? I love this comment. Kudos to the gentleman reluctant to jump on the serial killer bandwagon. I think everyone is sort of reluctant without more evidence. Triple kudos to Joel. That's not why I like this comment, but I do like it now. You raised excellent questions that elicit, didn't even see that part. So thank you for that. But if you listen to all three of these guests, none of them are jumping on any bandwagon. I think they're looking for the evidence. And that is the one thing that I have learned. The great Phil Waters on every Friday investigated over 400 homicide cases for the Houston PD. He always says, let the scene tell the story. Let the evidence tell you the story. So these people here, none of them are actively working this case, but they all have a wealth of knowledge about stuff related to this. Will, just back to you quickly. So there are reports that since the end of December 22, the FBI has been working with the Chicago Police Department on solving these cases. Is that unusual to be working in conjunction with the feds, or do you do that regularly?
Well, I mean, federal jurisdiction is a different thing too. The feds, there has to be jurisdiction for them to get involved. They help us out all the time if we call them and ask them. But as far as federal jurisdiction, Ken would speak of this probably better than me because I've never been a federal agent. But jurisdiction is an issue as far as taking over a prosecution. However, sometimes they have a lot more tools than we have with the city. Not unusual for the feds to help us out.
Ken Larson, Modine, who's America's favorite troll, and every once in a while he's serious on this show, as in the cases, as is the case right now. He says in the case of Schubert and Salvino, police have video footage, and Will was talking about this earlier, of them just walking into the river. Ken Larson, if you're investigating this, is it sort of game over at that point for the investigation? You just have video, they're walking in and that's it? Or do you still have to look into it, see if they were under the influence and, dot all your I's and cross all your T's?
just without seeing the video, but just the simple fact of walking in there, you have to go through the process of having an autopsy and the drug, see if there's any drugs in their system and so forth. But that's difficult. That's horrible. That's terrible. And it, as we know, as speakers here in this panel, one of the most horrifying and difficult things to do in this line of work is to knock on somebody's door and tell their parents that their child is dead, and to forward the evidence that you've given, such as you said about these people just either walking into the water and dying. That's what we have to show them. That's what we have to go with. That's difficult. Initially, Chicago is a busy city. A lot of cases. You have cases such as this where you have evidence of them just going into the water minus any autopsy, toxicology. I don't know what else can you really do? I don't mean to be cold, but that's the fact of the matter.
And Ken,
it's
go ahead, Will. No, go ahead, Will.
And Ken, it's like you said, it's not just footage of them showing up at the waterfront and going into the water. It's footage going back to some cases leaving the bar, picking them up on these pod cameras we have, and also private businesses where you just basically show the whole path and pattern. And even when family members are presented with this, it's still so difficult for them to understand that this could have possibly happened. And that's one of the toughest parts of making a notification. Who wants to hear that?
Peace. They want peace.
Exactly.
And it's difficult.
And Will was talking about it a bit earlier, but a lot of times, especially with younger people, a lot of families really can't accept it. And so they are adamant. No, it has to, I found that on suicides more than anything else, that they say, no, it had to have been a homicide. It had to have been a homicide. This person wouldn't do, and it's really difficult. And I completely understand. I mean, Will said it too. I wouldn't be able to handle that information. And so, it's just part of that processing for a lot of loved ones of subjects who die in accidental or overdose or suicide, that, please find a way that there is somebody I can blame for this, rather than just sitting in this kind of misery of the unknown.
And I
Sarah, won't. Go ahead, Will.
And I hate to see what Sarah's talking about as well too. Is a lot of times these poor families get victimized again, and they get victimized by unscrupulous private investigators who just keep collecting checks, coming up with theories that they can't prove. And I hate to see that as well. But people, they just don't want to let go. And I'm not saying all private investigators do that, but there's unscrupulous people out there that are taking advantage of these people's grief, and that just makes me angry.
Yeah, that is awful to hear, but I guess anything goes these days. Elle Rose, love the name. I always tell her that. Sarah, to you, has law enforcement used geofencing or the triangle map to grid these drownings? It sounds like you have, but do we know?
Not in any official capacity. Like I said, just because I've looked. I mean, part of working in a primarily civilian or consultancy basis now, there are agencies I work directly with, with the agency from the inside. But part of my reason when I presented this to Super Sleuths was, hey, if enough of us are curious, is there any chance, because it's a big group and we all have contacts all over the country, that we could get access to the actual case files on even a few of these? Because then when you can see the actual case, you can either say, okay, yeah, there is something a little bit more worth looking at in here, or no, this is very cut and dry. These are not connected, and this was, an accidental drowning. And so that was the main reason that I brought it up to the group, because then you could do something like that. Whether or not Chicago has done that in these cases, I would defer to Will on that.
Will, do you happen to know if they've done geofencing?
Oh, yes. Yes. The whole, like I spoke of earlier, of a kind of a little bit of a task force. They've gotten all of that stuff. And again, the issue with ours is some people kind of go in the same spot, but they're all over, other side of the city. But yes, they have done that.
And Will, people like to beat up on the police. I'm a huge.
I read it.
Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of law enforcement. For the record, I think the job you guys do is amazing. The police rule them as accidental and don't do any follow up. Any merit to that comment?
Absolutely none. But believe me when I tell you, after 32 years, I'm used to that type of comment. But absolutely none. Every one of these is investigated thoroughly.
There you go. Ken Larson, Ketchup, friend of the show. Could it be a woman? Reminds me of Eileen Warnos. We've had Monica Jordan on. She's a private investigator out of Tallahassee that actually was an investigator for her defense team, believe it or not. But Ken Larson, to you, I think everyone is always quick to assume it's got to be a male. How do you keep yourself straight as an investigator to keep your, remind yourself it could maybe be a woman?
Never say never, but again, you have to go with history, the analytics, and the facts and the evidence. I mean, Eileen Warren was definitely a different situation, but in this scenario, I'm not going to say no, never say no, but I don't see it. I don't see it.
Sarah, Phil Waters, I always invoke his name. He always tells us motivation for murder, sex, money, or drugs. Any sort of potential motive here in any of these killings other than these are predominantly young men?
Well, I mean, we know, at least in the ones that I've looked at, they were almost all to a person recovered with their wallets. So it's certainly not money, obviously excluding the guy who was abducted by the gypsy cabs. I don't know about drugs. This would be an awful lot of them for them to be connected by that. In terms of sex, I think that there is a sort of a subset of that in serial predation, when we're talking about serial killers, what we're really talking about the vast majority of the time is sexual homicide. So it doesn't always necessarily look sexual at the scene, but there is something about the act for the serial killer that is sexual in nature to them. So, if it were a serial killer, then yes, that could certainly be an element of it. And I just, I have to echo what Ken said, the likelihood of it being a woman. It actually doesn't look anything. I mean, I understand why people assume with Eileen Warnos because there were male victims and stuff. But those primarily all ended in robbery. It doesn't have any of the same. If this was all one person, or even some of these were one person, this is a very specific signature. There is something about this that they are getting off on, and that is very different from the way Eileen Warnos killed. And it's also exceedingly rare for that sort of wiring to be a female killer.
I'd love to be on a fly on the wall during a Super Sleuths meeting. It must be interesting. I'm going to try to get myself invited in one of those. So one of the more kind of perplexing of the cases is Richard Garcia. Will, he was 46 years old. He was recovered back on April 13th from the Chicago River near the Columbus Drive Bridge, which I'm sure you know, and I don't. Mm-hmm. He was still wearing his FedEx uniform when his remains were located. He had been reported missing from his Southside home in March. So he was reported missing in March, found in April. Cause and manner of death pending, according to the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. Kind of weird. He's in his FedEx uniform. I don't know if you had heard about that, if that stuck out to you. People say it is a little bit perplexing.
I heard about that one. And this is like what Ken was talking about. When that body's been in the water for a month, that's why you're going to have the pending cause and manner, because sometimes we just can't figure it out. And I got to tell you, sometimes the medical examiner will make it an undetermined manner of death and the cause, depending on the condition of the remains. That one's a little weird. But again, in cases of suicide or cases of accidental, you wouldn't change your clothes if you were going to have an accident. So yeah, it's a little different, but it doesn't shock me, to be honest.
A couple of interesting comments. Tiff Knox, men wander to pee in the rivers and lose balance. So I've heard. I guess that's one possible explanation. And Ken Larson, I know you're a father. Could this be an Uber driver? Most young people use Uber when they go out drinking. A larger picture, more macro. We've got majority of women who are members of STS Nation, which I'm not complaining about. Happy to have them all. Any words of advice in this day and age where Uber drivers just swing by, pick you up, you don't really know whose car you're getting into, what you're doing? How do you keep yourself safe, Ken?
Common sense, I think, would initially be. I think Uber does a pretty good job. Lyft does a fairly good job in verifying, who the driver is, and the tag information stuff, and information such as that, as far as verification is concerned. But we go back to, like I said before, about these the gypsy cabs and people who are desperate. Hey, you even mentioned it yourself. 2 a.m. if it's winter, it's cold, you're not getting a ride, and you grab somebody you get into a warm car and you go anywhere. That's where you really have to have a heightened security. But I think Uber, for the most part, of course, there's been histories where they've had issues too. But for the most part, they're used every day very safely. So just verification. But any other rider outside of a licensed taxi driver or an Uber driver would be very cautious.
A quick
Absolutely.
programming note. Will, hang on one second. I'm going to get right to
Sure.
you. Chelsea Whitaker here says, real quick, escaped Brazilian dude still on the lam, right? She's talking about, and I just blanked on his name. He escaped a prison outside of Philadelphia. There's a nationwide manhunt for him. And tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to discuss that and Rachel Morin's killer. She's the mom of 5 in Maryland who was basically bludgeoned to death on a hiking trail. And they got video of who they believe is a suspect. No ID on him. That happened back on August 5th. So how do you hunt down these escaped killers? One is on the loose. One escaped from prison. We've got Lenny DePaul. If you haven't heard of him, Google him. He used to run the U.S. Marshal's office out of New York City. Scott Duffy's coming on, and Phil Waters' friend is coming on, who's a former U.S. Marshal out of Houston. That's going to be a really interesting show, kind of inside baseball on how the manhunters hunt these men and sometimes women. Cavalcante, Tiff Knox coming to my what's his first name? I forget his last name is Cavalcante, Brazilian national who got just convicted to a life sentence without parole and somehow gets out of prison. Will, did not mean to cut you off. Go for it.
No, I was just going to talk about what Ken was talking about, the Uber drivers, and they do a really nice job. And you'll get a thing saying this is a license plate of the car you should be getting into. But there are these gypsy cab drivers that Ken's also talking about that have Uber and Lyft stickers in their windows that at quick glance, someone could just get in the car without checking the plate. But when you talk about heightened awareness, a lot of people getting into these Ubers at 2:00 in the morning do not have heightened awareness for obvious reasons.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And bottom line, some of the best investigators give the simplest advice, like don't keep both earbuds in when you're walking to your car. Don't have your face glued to your phone. Keep yourself safe. There's a lot of predators out there. Heather N says, Danilo Cavalcante, which Tiff Knox also gave me the name. That is the guy's name out of Philadelphia. And then we have an unidentified murderer again, who's responsible for Rachel Morin's death. So we are going to look into that. I'm actually very excited to hear what these guys have to say. That's 12:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on Garcia, who's the man found in the FedEx uniform, but then there's also a Navy sailor we talked about named Seamus Gray. His remains were discovered 6 days later in Lake Michigan in the Chicago suburb of Waukegan. He was last seen leaving a place called the Ibiza Bar. No obvious signs of injury. Anything stand out to you about Seamus and or the FedEx driver?
The FedEx driver I had not heard about. If he was found in his uniform, that certainly seems like it wasn't something he was planning for very long. If that's, like you said, you're not going to, think you're going to be found like that, which would make me suspect at least the chance of foul play, you know, but again, it depends on what the scene is telling you, what the body is telling you. Seamus Gray is one of the ones that was on my list. That's the one that I was referencing where I said it was in, you know, a suburb. And it, you know, other than just the pattern matches up, the way the sort of, I think on almost all of these at some point, they're in communication with people by phone or FaceTime or texting or something. And then the phone kind of goes dead out of nowhere. And just that, you know, he certainly, in terms of physical victimology, he has the same look as a lot of these guys. But again, you know, once you get to my age, I guess, you know, all guys in their 20s kind of look vaguely the same. So.
Not their 60s, not their 60s.
Yeah. Well, no, you guys all look the same too, just in a different way.
We just look the same in a lot worse way. Merritt Seeger says, are they using dating apps, which is a good point, Ken Larson. Digital forensics helping to solve a lot of crimes. Ken, can we be all but certain that investigators are looking into their cell phones, looking into what apps they're on, who they're contacting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
I hope so, because that's, again, these phones are people's lives. That's their true identity. You look in there and you know who they are. There's simple tools that I don't think many people know, but like, for example, if you have a Gmail account, well, Google is always sending every 30 seconds a signal where you're at, right? Because they don't do it because they're tracking you. They do it because they want to make sure you have access to get their, you know, to their products and so forth. So, and I believe that even if you turn it off, you put it in airplane mode, Google will still send out every 30 seconds a signal to the closest tower. So, you know, we can pretty much, with the geofencing and the technology that's out there and the analytics on a phone, you'll learn a lot as to who they were communicating with, what they were saying, and where they were last seen. And then not only just the phones and the analytics, but of course the watches and everything else.
Yeah, Big Brother is definitely watching. Sarah, back to you on this. So back to Tracy Walder, who's a friend of the show, a best guest. She was talking about clusters, and she said 2 bodies were pulled from the water in 2023. 2 recovered from the water December 2022, and then 4 April 2022. She's talking about clusters, 2, 2, 4. How relevant or irrelevant is that in your opinion?
It's, I mean, you know, good armchair detectiving, because that's certainly one of the things that I've looked at when I've been sort of, like I said, just kind of keeping a running tab of some of these for the last, you know, 16, 17 years. Like, you know, there's a cluster, and actually I'm just going to circle to this because we were talking about the dating apps, but there was a cluster in within a 10-day window in Minneapolis, Eau Claire, and Collegeville, Minnesota, all within 10 days, 3 guys, very, very, very similar physical appearance. And and this was 2002, sorry, this was a very long time ago. But one of the guys, they recovered from his computer a huge collage of just like headshots of what would have been from an early online dating app kind of thing. It was all, you know, sort of like, you know, good looking men his age for the most part, stuff like that, but it didn't have any names with them. So if you look up the Joshua Guimond case out of Collegeville, police are still saying, if you recognize somebody in any of these photos, let us know, because it could potentially be that, yeah, he was going to meet somebody from one of these apps that night. So that's, you know, that's worth doing. Yeah, clusters can be significant, but the thing about clusters that then sends me in the other direction to say, well, it's indicative of somebody in the end of a serial career, right? Like we tend to see if they ramp up to the point where they're now engaging in a spree as opposed to a serial with like the cooling down period. This is one of the things Gary and I talked about last week, that we more often than not see a spurt like that at the end of a serial career. When you look at Bundy, right? Like how he just kind of like went nuts, and he has that, horrible attack at Cayo, and then he kills Kimberly Leach, and there's like no cool down period in any of this. And so it then wouldn't make sense that you would see that happen, and then a year later see it happen again, and then a year later, you know what I mean? So that would then send me in the other direction and say maybe they're related to each other, but not all of the clusters then related. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Will, to you, your old department, the Chicago PD, they came out, said, and this is a direct quote here, at this time, there is no evidence suggesting there is a connection between these drowning deaths. The Chicago Police Department conducts thorough death investigations as we work to bring a measure of closure to the families of these and all victims. Meanwhile, some data from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office showed that 61% of drowning investigations are ruled accidental. Will, I just kind of want you to reiterate that. A lot of times people see these statements and they think, they're just putting out, like a stamped statement. But again, you guys take this stuff very seriously. You make sure to follow through on all leads. Is that correct?
100%. It's exactly like Ken said, with all the phone information and the cameras, the technology, you couldn't get lost if you had to with these telephones. We look into every bit of that. We look into the phones for sure. Video is huge. That's why we can say with some certainty in a lot of these cases, we know the exact path that these people took to get in the water. The Navy, the sailor, we know that he walked down a certain pier because he was found about 10 feet off of that pier where he was seen walking. No video of him going in the water, I don't believe, but walking down towards that area alone, yes. So we don't just dismiss these things, especially nowadays with the technology. Back a long time ago when I was a homicide detective and you'd catch a body in the middle of a field with nobody around, you had a lot of problems trying to solve that case. But now we can track people's movements, almost to present time. So yes, we definitely put work into every one of these cases.
Will, do you know the clearance rate for Chicago PD roughly?
It's not good. I know that. It's somewhere. Let's talk about. You can talk about current year. We're talking about all together. We're solving old cases. I want to say we're somewhere in the 30% rate for current cases, and because we can solve some old cases, we're probably around 50.
Wow. We just had the former Detroit police chief when he took office there in Detroit. When he was sworn in, the clearance rate was 11% in Detroit, significantly higher after he left. He's an interesting guy. He's going to be running for Senate in the great state of Michigan. Ken Larson, to you, and then we'll start to wrap up. Just a couple more quick things. But we floated around this idea, or it has been floated around as it relates to all these drownings, about a possible smiley face killer. This is a theory that has evolved over the last decade or two. I think it began more than a decade ago by two New York detectives, a guy named Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, as well as a guy named Dr. Lee Gilberston, a criminal justice professor at St. Cloud University. And they have alleged that a number of drownings of young men across the U.S. are related to a serial killer or a group of serial killers who typically leave marks of a smiley face or another gang symbol near the sites of their murders. No smiley faces here, I don't think, Sarah, and you can weigh in on this after Ken. But Ken, what do you make? I mean, Sarah said it's kind of outlandish to think that there's a group of serial killers. What do you make of this assertion?
I know that those three gentlemen have dedicated their life after retirement, and I think one of them he gave up his pension and spent all his money to pursue this because he truly believes it. Who am I to say he's wrong? I knew that some of the theories that they pushed out there, you have to scratch your head, but I'm never going to tell anybody any day, absolutely not. If you believe in it and you can back it up with some facts. I know the dark web, and then there's been some theories and initiations to certain clubs where you had that. You take that in and you absorb it the best you can. But I did do a little research on it. Some of the material that's out there can be somewhat. I mean, they could convince you that there's something behind it, but it's been a long time coming. Nothing's ever really, I think, evolved from it. I'm sure that they will probably, if we were ever have them here, they would differ with that statement or my opinion on that. But it's, in my personal opinion, is dealing with facts. I think it's a long shot.
Sarah, you mentioned it earlier, but just to, as Ken just mentioned, it sounds like these three guys who are serious investigators, I think a criminology professor, they've invested a lot of time and energy, but you don't think there's any credence to it necessarily.
So I like to sort of differentiate what the detectives, the retired detectives' original study was. They released a report in I think 2009 called it was like Forensics in Underwater Deaths or something like. I can get you the title if you want to share it, but it was really more of almost an academic study or like a paper. And in that one, they had it was either 15 or 16 cases, and in a lot of those, they had the toxicology, they had autopsy reports. So I haven't, I would suspect that if they're talking about those particular cases that they really, really, really examined closely, I'm with Ken. I'm not going to say, oh, I know better than you when I haven't even looked at any of that stuff. Where I think the stuff that I'm talking about in terms of the way the kind of the brand name of the smiley face killer thing has just taken it on a life of its own. And I don't know whether those guys subscribe to the idea of like a whole gang of these guys operating around the world. I just have seen that in some like public forums and in Facebook groups and web sleuths and stuff like that. And that's the stuff that I'm talking about is just like, we've never seen that. We've seen stuff like the Satanic Panic that all turned out to be baloney, and I think it reads more like that. But in terms of what the original, 15 or so cases that they talked about as possibly being linked, I am absolutely not in a position to deny any of those because they had the reports and I don't. So.
And Tiff Knox brought up Austin, Texas. Sarah, back to you since you studied all this. So 5 bodies have been recovered from Austin's Lady Bird Lake just this year. I don't know. What do you make of Austin, Texas? It seems strange, right? That was making headlines a while back.
Yeah, none of the Austin ones came into the presentation that I did last week, but I have been sort of peripherally aware that there are some down there too. It is, all of them seem like, oh, there's just too much coincidence. There's just too much. But the larger point then becomes, if we talk about a bunch in Austin, a bunch in New York, a bunch in Chicago, it then does enter the realm of like, kind of like, we've never seen anything like that. And it's pretty unlikely that would be, all like one person or one group responsible for stuff like that. So, but again, I don't know the cases, and I would be curious to see if the Austin police are looking into them the same way that the Chicago and NYPD have been doing.
I'd like to get the guys who are studying the smiley face killer case, get them on the program. We'll see if we can do that. Got to thank these best guests. Always bringing the receipts, as they say. Willis Villar spent 31 years, 7 months, but who's counting, in law enforcement, all with the Chicago PD. It was roughly 27 years. We were trying to do the math in Homicide, give or take a year or two. 6 years as an officer-involved shootings investigator supervisor. That's how he left the department. Now he is retired. L. Rose says, easy to hide in a big city, work with a bar person to watch someone all night and then put something in a drink. What kind of challenges, Will, working in a major metropolis like Chicago as opposed to, a small town? I grew up in suburban New Jersey. What are some of the challenges and your final thoughts here?
Sheer volume and sheer area. We have 5 detective areas in the city of Chicago that cover certain parts of time. 5 detective areas. We're dealing with 800 plus murders a year. It's sheer volume, and just the whole geographic location of the city we just have a lot of business, unfortunately.
How many homicide detectives?
Well, every area's probably got 30. So 5 areas, 150 really good dedicated homicide teams. Per watch, 30 per watch. Midnights don't have teams. Midnights pretty much do scenes, but what's that? Maybe a total of about 300 total to handle 800 murders. And also some areas get a lot more murders than the other areas.
Someone said, wow, 800 a year, Miss We Last Seas. I believe in the Republic of Ireland. They corrected me. I can no longer say the UK. So they're not used to 800 homicides a year in one American city. Joel, you are facetiously funny. I will take that as a compliment. Speaking of that, Will, I was explaining to my 3 young kids, I started in the game late, and close to my mid-50s, and I got a 9, a 7, and a 4-year-old, so I don't know what I was thinking. But I explained to them that I had to get out of the news business because the COE, the chief of everything, was going to basically end the marriage because I was traveling every day of the month. So I was explaining to my rotten little kids, that's why Daddy's now a podcaster, which, by the way, they think it's way cooler to be on YouTube than on Fox News. They hate Fox News. My question to you is, how's retirement? You staying busy? You miss the work?
The common thing people say is you miss you don't miss the circus, you miss the clowns. And I've only been retired since July 14th, so it just feels like a long vacation right now. So I will have to find something to do with myself in the winter. Summer is easy to take care of things, but when it gets to be cold out, like you're talking about the marches in Chicago, I may have to be a podcaster in Arizona or something.
You have to come down to Miami, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to get you on as a best guest more often than you want. Black Widower says, the Republic of Ireland isn't in the UK. That's why, Joel. Thank you, Black Widower, for explaining that. I'm not that smart, and geography, not my strong point. And Miss We Last See reminding me she's in Scotland, not Ireland. So please forgive me. Ken Larson, another phenomenal investigative mind. He's a former detective and task force officer with Fairfax County Police, and then went on to a career in the FBI. He's challenging Phil Waters. Someone said that they're going to take bets on how many times I mentioned Phil Waters. I got a man crush on the guy. What can I tell you? He's his clearance rate in homicide, I think, was 93%. He investigated over 400 cases, so that's pretty damn good. But Ken Larson, your final thoughts on this?
I think that theories are great, right? Theories are kind of sexy. I don't want to call them conspiracies or whatever, but they are. But what do we deal with? If you have a theory that makes some sense and you give me some facts with it, give me some forensics with it, give me some witnesses to get back up the facts and all this forensic evidence, give me some digital evidence. Hey, I'm all in. Convince me of these theories, and let's put a case together and do what we got to do. But in the meantime, if it's just stories and theories without those other 5 factors, I'm too busy. I got to go do something else. And that I don't mean to sound not to be callous. It's just, as we've just stated several times here, volume is everything. We're busy, man. And then you can't deal with theories. There was an old detective I worked with. He would slam the door at his desk after somebody called him up on the phone, and he just said, listen, my desk is full of information names, but I need something. Would you call me with something? And he'd hang up the phone and slam the desk, right? And it was entertaining, but it just came out of the blue because he's tired of hearing theories. We need facts.
Anytime I listen to these gentlemen and women, I always wonder, what is it like to be the child of a detective or an FBI agent? Because they're always looking at, like you say, you did your homework, and I say to my kids, okay, but these guys are like, show me the homework. I need to start doing that. Show me the evidence. Heather N says, most excellent guest, best guest in true crime. Not just a tagline, a reality. Of course, one of those is Sarah Kalin, like Kato Kalin, spelled differently though.
I'm never coming back if you
Former, spelled by the way, Cailean, beautiful Republic of Ireland name.
Yes.
She's a former police officer and sex crimes detective. with a decade of service in federal and municipal law enforcement agencies. She was also co-creator, executive producer, and host of the 4-part docuseries Hell in the Heartland, What Happened to Ashley and Loria on HLN and HBO Max. She's been a featured consultant and commentator on Wondery's Manslaughter and Rabia Chowdhury's Undisclosed, and she is a team investigator for the Cold Case Foundation. Bottom line question to you, Sarah, and your final thoughts. Is this the work of a serial killer? Do you really think, or no? And closing thoughts.
I think for somebody like me, right? So I'm somebody who does get, I'm afforded a certain amount of time because I work primarily on cold cases. I do sort of have the time to really dive down weird rabbit holes. And so for me, there are certainly some interesting things here that I think are worth rabbit holing. I don't know that I would necessarily say yet we are anywhere near being able to say, one way or the other, but especially, in the affirmative that there is one person or a handful of people responsible. But for somebody like me who is afforded the luxury of a little bit more time and in-depth digging, I would, I will continue to kind of poke around with these. I have to say my agent will kill me if I don't say that the more recent thing people probably know me from is the Discovery ID podcast, Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom, which was an 8-part series that just came out this year. So I know I'm going to get texts as soon as I get off if I don't mention.
No, I'm glad you plugged it. Always let me know. But what's it called again, and where do we find it?
It's called Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom? It's an 8-part investigative series about a case that I have been working on. I continue. It is a cold case out of Mobile, Alabama that I've been working on for 4 years now, but it sort of follows that investigation and goes into some of the suspects in that. And that you can get that wherever you get your podcasts.
There you go. You better check it out. Elle Rose coming to us from Australia, just to put things in perspective. One person dies in our state, it makes the nightly news, mostly stabbings or domestic violence here. Imagine if that was the case in Chicago. A quick programming note. Tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Danilo Cavalcante, I got his name right, the Brazilian national who's on the run after murdering his girlfriend from prison. He's still on the run. We're going to talk to these guys who are manhunters to talk about how they do it. In addition, they're going to talk about where they think or how they can catch Rachel Morin's killer, who's also on the loose. There's a video of him, but there is no ID. They got a DNA hit, unidentified. And El Boogie, love the channel, love you back. Best guess, as I said, not just a tagline. And then Thursday night, Sarah knows her well. Dr. Ann Burgess, the living legend, is coming back on to discuss BTK with Cheryl McCullum and Dr. Joni Johnston, who studies serial killers. And I'll say his name one last time. Bill Waters, Scott Duffy. Duffy's doing double duty tomorrow and Friday. Friday, it's 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, love you, America. Love you, Chicago. Love you, Virginia. Love you, Pennsylvania. Love you, Ireland, Scotland, and everywhere in between. Hang on, guess, for 1 second for me.